This necklace, it belonged to my mother. How do you have it?
For Elellanena Vance, a woman whose name was synonymous with unimaginable wealth, every object held a price tag. From the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan to her fleet of private jets, her world was a meticulously curated collection of acquisitions, a testament to her unparalleled success. Yet, within the hushed elegance of a Michelin-starred restaurant, her gaze fell upon a simple silver locket adorning a waitress, a young woman clearly struggling to make ends meet. In that instant, the billionaire's carefully constructed empire of steel and glass crumbled, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming torrent of tears and a long-buried memory, a half-century-old secret rising to the surface, threatening to shatter her carefully maintained composure. What was it about this seemingly insignificant, inexpensive piece of jewelry that could unravel the tightly wound composure of one of the world's most powerful women? The answer lay hidden within a poignant tale of lost love, forced sacrifice, and a secret that all the money in the world couldn't buy. Elellanena moved through the world with an air of quiet, practiced authority. At 82, her posture remained impeccable, her silver hair styled with flawless precision, its sheen catching the light, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed absolutely nothing. Tonight, she dined at Aria, San Francisco's most exclusive establishment, a place where the tasting menu alone cost more than most city residents paid in monthly rent. It was a Tuesday, a day devoid of any particular significance, which was precisely why she chose it. Anniversaries and birthdays were far too laden with painful memories, haunted by the ghosts of a life once lived and cherished. Tuesdays, however, were blessedly empty. Devoid of such agonizing reminders, her dining companion was her son, Julian Vance Vomishmas, the CEO of Vance Industries, the sprawling global tech empire his late father, Richard, had built. Julian, sharp, ambitious, and impeccably dressed in a suit tailored with surgical precision, spoke in the familiar, monotonous drone of quarterly earnings and market acquisitions, a soundtrack to Elellanina's life that she had long since learned to filter out. "Mother, are you listening?" Julian asked, a hint of impatience coloring his voice. "The board is pushing for the acquisition of Aerosphere. It's a $1 trillion play." Elellanena offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, her gaze drifting around the opulent dining room. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light onto tables draped in heavy linen. The clinking of silverware created a delicate, almost ethereal symphony. It was all so perfect, so meticulously controlled, yet so suffocatingly lonely. Richard had been gone for a decade, and with him, the vibrant colors had drained from her world, leaving behind a stark, almost sterile emptiness. Her life had become a gilded cage, beautiful from the outside, but cold, empty, and utterly isolating within. A young waitress approached their table to refill their water glasses. Her movements were quiet and efficient, yet spoke volumes of underlying exhaustion. Her uniform, though pristine, bore the faintest signs of wear at the cuffs. Her brown hair, pulled back in a simple ponytail, was slightly askew, hinting at a rushed pace. She was unremarkable, just another face in the endless parade of service staff that populated Elellanina's life, easily forgotten. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Vance?" "Mrs. Vance," the waitress corrected gently, her voice soft but clear. Julian dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already engrossed in his phone. But Elellanina's gaze remained fixed, not on the waitress's face, but on her neck. Peeking from beneath the collar of her uniform was a delicate silver chain slender and elegant, the kind a young girl might wear. But it was the pendant that stole Elellenena's breath, arresting her completely. It was a star-burst locket, its silver slightly tarnished with age. At its very center, where the rays of the star converged, was a minuscule, deep blue sapphire, no bigger than a pinhead. Time seemed to stop. The murmur of conversation in the restaurant faded into a dull roar, barely perceptible in Elellenena's ears. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. It couldn't be. After all these years, it simply couldn't be possible. There were millions of lockets in the world, but none quite like this one. This locket was unique. She knew every groove, every imperfection in the hand-engraved rays. She remembered the feel of its cool metal against her skin. She had designed it herself. "Mother, what is it?" "You look pale," Julian said, finally looking up from his screen, his concern palpable. Eleanor didn't hear him. Her vision narrowed, tunneling in on the locket, the singular focus obliterating everything else. A torrent of memories, locked away for 50 years, broke free, flooding her consciousness. A summer of stolen glances, the intoxicating scent of oil paints and turpentine, the profound weight of a forbidden love, and the gut-wrenching pain of a choice she had been forced to make, a choice that had irrevocably altered the course of her life. The waitress, sensing the older woman's intense stare, shifted uncomfortably. She instinctively tucked the locket further into her collar, a subconscious attempt at self-preservation, a protective gesture. But it was too late. Elellanena had seen it. A choked, agonizing sob escaped Elellenena's lips, a sound utterly alien in the refined atmosphere of Aria. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound, soul-deep grief. Hot, unstoppable tears streamed down her perfectly powdered cheeks, carving paths through the mask of composure she had meticulously maintained for decades. "That locket," she whispered, her voice trembling, her finger pointing with a shaky hand. "Where? Where did you get that locket?" The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. Julian stared, dumbfounded, at his mother's unprecedented emotional breakdown. The young waitress, whose name tag read Mia, looked from the weeping billionaire to the locket at her neck, her face a canvas of confusion and alarm. Elellanena Vance, the matriarch of a financial dynasty, a woman who had faced down hostile takeovers and buried a husband without shedding a single public tear, was crying, not with quiet dignity, but with the raw, heart-shattering anguish of a long-lost hope impossibly reappearing. The scene at Table 7 sent a ripple of consternation through Aria. The maitre d', a man named Jean-Pierre, who prided himself on orchestrating flawless evenings, hurried over, his face a mask of professional concern. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Vance?" he inquired, his voice a low, soothing murmur. Julian, recovering from his initial shock, quickly took control. "My mother is just feeling a bit unwell. A momentary episode. We'll be fine." He shot a sharp, dismissive glare at the waitress. "Mia, you can go." But Elellenena's hand shot out, her grip surprisingly strong as she latched onto Mia's arm. "No, don't go, please," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "That locket, I must know about it." Mia stood frozen, like a deer caught in the headlights. The attention of the entire room was on her, acutely aware of her worn shoes, the pen stain on her apron, and the immense, unbridgeable gulf between her world and that of the woman holding her arm. It was my mother's," Mia stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "She gave it to me." Your mother? Elellena's eyes searched Mia's face, looking for a resemblance, a clue, anything that might connect them. What is her name? Where is she? Julian intervened, his tone firm. Mother, this is hardly the time or place. You're causing a scene. He pried his mother's fingers from Mia's arm and turned to the young woman. My apologies. My mother is tired. She mistook your necklace for something else. He pulled out a thick black card holder. For your trouble. He attempted to press several $100 bills into her hand. Mia flinched back as if the money were burning hot. No, thank you, sir. It's all right. Her eyes darted back to Elellanena, who was now weeping silently, her shoulders shaking. There was a raw, genuine pain in the older woman's eyes that transcended their different stations in life. It was the universal pain of a human heart breaking. Please, Elellanena said again, her voice regaining a sliver of its customary command, though it was frayed with emotion. I will pay you for it. Name your price. $10,000? $20,000? Mia's eyes widened. $20,000 was more than she earned in an entire year. It was enough to cover her mother's mounting medical bills, to finally fix the leaky roof in their tiny apartment, to breathe freely for the first time in years. A wave of temptation washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. She could solve so many problems with that money. She instinctively clutched the locket. It was cool against her warm skin, a familiar weight she had known her entire life. It was the only thing she had left from her mother that felt truly hers. Her mother, Sarah, was sick, her memory fading in and out like a faulty radio signal. But when she was lucid, she would sometimes touch the locket and smile. That's your story, she would whisper, her voice frail. It's all in there. It'll keep you safe. Mia didn't know what story it held. Her mother's past was a collection of fragmented, half-remembered tales. She didn't know who her father was or where her mother had come from before arriving in San Francisco with a baby and a single suitcase. The locket was her only tangible link to that mystery, to her own identity. To sell it would be like selling a piece of her soul. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance, Mia said, her voice finding a surprising strength. I can't sell it. It's not for sale. Julian scoffed in disbelief. Don't be ridiculous. It's a piece of silver. I'll write you a check for $50,000 right now. You can quit this job tonight. The offer hung in the air, glittering and seductive. $50,000, a fortune. But as Mia looked at Elellanena, she saw not a billionaire trying to buy a trinket, but a woman desperately trying to reclaim a piece of her past. And Mia, who had so little of her own past to hold on to, understood that sentiment perfectly. No, she said more firmly this time. My answer is no. I'm very sorry for your distress. She gave a slight formal bow. If you'll excuse me, I need to get back to my work. With that, she turned and walked away, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the stares of every patron, hear the whispers following her. She fled to the relative safety of the kitchen, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of a stainless steel counter to steady herself. Back at the table, Julian was furious. The audacity! A $50,000 offer for some cheap bauble, and she refuses. She's playing you, Mother. She'll come back tomorrow with a lawyer demanding $1 million. But Elellanena wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on the kitchen door through which Mia had disappeared. The girl's refusal hadn't angered her. It had intrigued her. It confirmed that the locket's value was not monetary. The girl cherished it, just as she was meant to. Get me her name, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice low and resolute. The tears had stopped, replaced by a steely determination. Her full name, her address, everything you can find out about her. What are you going to do? Julian asked, bewildered. Elellanena dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, her composure slowly returning, like armor being reassembled piece by piece. If she won't sell a memory, she said, her voice dangerously quiet, then I shall have to buy her story. The next morning, the sterile quiet of Elellanena Vance's penthouse apartment was disrupted by the arrival of a man named David Harrison. Harrison was a private investigator, a man whose nondescript appearance belied a formidable talent for unearthing secrets. He was discreet, efficient, and expensive, the best in the business. Elellanena, dressed in a silk robe, sat opposite him in her vast, sun-drenched living room, which offered a panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge. The emotional storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind an unsettling calm and a singular, obsessive focus. I want to know everything about her, Elellanena stated, her voice devoid of its earlier fragility. Amelia Russo. She works at Aria. Find out where she lives, who her family is, what her circumstances are. Be thorough, but be invisible. I don't want her to know she's being watched. Understood? Understood, Mrs. Vance, Harrison said, making a few notes in a small leather-bound book. Julian, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. This is absurd, Mother. You're paying a man thousands of dollars to investigate a waitress. If you want the necklace, our legal team can draft an offer she can't refuse, or we can find its provenance and claim it as a stolen family artifact. It wasn't stolen, Eleanor snapped, her gaze sharp. And this is not about the locket anymore. It is about the girl. There was something in her eyes, Julian, a resilience. And she refused your money. That is not the behavior of a common opportunist. It's the behavior of a clever opportunist, Julian countered. She knows she has you on the hook. She's waiting for a bigger offer. Elellanena fell silent, her gaze drifting towards a small dust-free bookshelf in the corner of the room. It was out of place amongst the modern art and designer furniture. It held old, leather-bound volumes of poetry and several worn books on art history. Julian never paid them any mind, but for Elellanena, that corner was a shrine to a past she had tried, but failed, to completely erase. While Harrison gathered his instructions and departed, Elellanena walked over to the bookshelf. Her fingers traced the spine of a book titled The Renaissance of Light. She pulled it from the shelf. Tucked inside was a faded black-and-white photograph, its edges softened by time. It showed a much younger Elellanena, her hair long and unbound, her smile radiant and unburdened. Her arm was linked with that of a young man with intense dark eyes and a paint-smudged shirt. He was handsome, with a wild energy that seemed to leap from the photograph. His name was Thomas Reed. The locket hadn't been a gift from her late husband, Richard. Richard had given her diamonds, emeralds, entire real estate portfolios. He had given her a life of unimaginable luxury and security. But he had never given her the locket. The locket was from Thomas. He had been a painter, a brilliant, penniless artist living in a tiny studio in North Beach. Elellanena, then a young heiress from a suffocatingly strict, old-money family, had met him during a rebellious visit to a local art gallery. Their love affair had been a whirlwind, secret, passionate, and doomed from the start. Her parents would never have approved of a match so far beneath her station. Thomas had crafted the locket himself, melting down his grandfather's silver cufflinks. He had hammered and shaped the metal, engraving the starburst pattern with his own tools. The tiny sapphire, he'd told her, he'd traded a painting for. It's the color of your eyes when you look at my art, he'd said. his voice full of a sincerity that Richard, for all his power, could never muster. Their love had a consequence. A baby. A daughter. The memory still had the power to steal her breath. Her parents had been furious. Their disappointment a cold, crushing weight. They had orchestrated everything. She was sent away to a private clinic in a remote part of the state. Thomas was threatened, paid off, and told to disappear from her life forever. He had tried to fight it, but he was no match for the power and influence of her family. Elellanena was allowed to hold her baby only once. A beautiful, perfect little girl. Before the adoption agency took her, Elellanena had pressed the starburst locket into the infant's swaddling clothes. A desperate, silent promise that she would one day find her. She named her Lily, but her parents had covered their tracks too well. The adoption was sealed, anonymous. By the time Elellanena was free from her family's control, married to the kind and powerful Richard Vance, who offered her a respectable escape, all trails to her daughter had gone cold. She had hired investigators over the years, but they had found nothing. Eventually, the pain became a dull, constant ache. A ghost she learned to live with until last night, when seeing that locket had ripped open the 50-year-old wound. Could it be a coincidence? A replica? No. She knew in her bones it was the original, which meant that the waitress, Amelia Russo, was somehow connected to her lost Lily. The intercom buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Harrison is on the line. He says he has some preliminary information of interest." Elellena's hand trembled as she picked up the phone. "Yes, Mrs. Vance." Harrison's voice was professional and clipped. "Amelia Russo lives at 14B Orchard Street in the Mission District. She's the sole caregiver for her mother, Sarah Russo. I'm looking into Sarah now, but the interesting part is the finances. They're in significant medical debt. Miss Russo works 2 jobs, the dinner shift at Aria and a morning shift at a diner called The Daily Grind. Her mother's condition? It appears to be degenerative, neurological. The bills are overwhelming." Elellanena sank into a chair. The girl wasn't a clever opportunist holding out for more money. She was desperate. She had refused $50,000, a sum that could have eased her burden immensely, out of pure sentiment. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Elellanena said, her voice strained. "Keep digging. I want to know everything about Sarah Russo." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. Sarah? The name meant nothing to her. But the girl's poverty, her quiet dignity, her fierce protection of the one link to her past. It was all starting to form a picture, one that was both terrifying and filled with an impossible flickering hope. Julian Vance did not share his mother's sentimental intrigue. He saw the situation in stark, binary terms, a problem and a solution. The problem was a waitress who had stumbled upon a piece of leverage and was causing his mother significant emotional distress. The solution was to apply overwhelming force. Bypassing his mother, who he felt was becoming irrationally obsessed, Julian had his own team run a background check on Amelia Russo. The results were the same as Harrison's, but Julian interpreted them differently. He saw not a struggling daughter, but a collection of vulnerabilities. Debt, a sick parent, a precarious financial existence. These were levers to be pulled. 2 days after the incident at Aria, Mia was finishing her shift at the Daily Grind, her second job. It was a greasy spoon diner, a world away from the refined elegance of Aria. Her feet ached, and the smell of bacon grease clung to her clothes. All she wanted was to go home, check on her mother, and fall into bed. As she stepped out into the drizzly afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows discreetly lowering. A man in a suit, not Julian, but clearly one of his lieutenants, got out. "Miss Russo," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Mr. Julian Vance would like a word with you." Mia's heart sank. She had been dreading this. "I'm sorry, I'm really tired. I have to get home." "It will only take a moment," the man insisted, gesturing to the open car door. It wasn't a request. Reluctantly, Mia slid into the plush leather interior. Julian Vance sat opposite her, his laptop open, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. He didn't look up for a full minute, a deliberate power play that made Mia feel small and insignificant. "Miss Russo," he finally said, closing the laptop, "I'll be direct. My mother has developed a fixation on your necklace. It is unhealthy. I want to put an end to it." "I already told your mother it's not for sale," Mia said, clutching her bag. "Everything is for sale," Julian countered smoothly. "You're simply negotiating. It's a bold strategy, I'll admit. Refusing the initial offer to drive up the price. But the game is over." He slid a thick envelope across the seat. "Inside is a check for $75,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. You sign the paper, you give us the locket, and you never contact my mother or any member of my family again. You also, of course, resign from your position at Arya." Mia stared at the envelope. $75,000. The number was even more staggering than the last, but the way he presented it felt like an insult, a transaction stripping all emotion from the equation. "It's not about the money," she insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "It has sentimental value." Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sentimental value doesn't pay for oncology specialists at UCSF Medical Center, does it? Or for the experimental drug trials for early-onset Alzheimer's? We know about your mother, Sarah. We know about the debt collectors. We know that social worker, Miss Albright, is considering moving your mother into a state-run facility because you can no longer provide adequate care." Mia felt the blood drain from her face. They had dug into her life, into the most painful, private corners of her existence. They had taken her struggle and turned it into a weapon to use against her. It felt violating, cruel. "How dare you?" she whispered, a mixture of fear and fury rising within her. "This is not a threat, Miss Russo. It's an observation of fact," Julian said, his voice cold as ice. "I am offering you a lifeline. That money can secure the best care for your mother. It can give you a life free from the constant anxiety of debt, all for a piece of metal. It's a logical, practical choice." He was twisting the knife, framing her love for her mother against her attachment to the locket. He was making her feel selfish for holding on to the one thing that gave her a sense of history. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not cry in front of this man. She thought of her mother, of the fear in her eyes during her bad days, and the brief, beautiful moments of clarity. This locket was a part of that, a part of her mother's essence. "The answer is still no," Mia said, her voice trembling but resolute. "What you are doing is monstrous. Please just leave me alone." Julian's expression hardened. The veneer of corporate civility vanished, replaced by undisguised contempt. "Fine, have it your way, but understand this. My family has resources. We can make things difficult. Landlords can be persuaded to terminate leases. Employers can be convinced that a certain employee is a source of disruption. You are a fly buzzing around an elephant, Miss Russo. I strongly suggest you stop before you get swatted." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The driver opened her door. Mia scrambled out of the car, her legs unsteady. The black sedan sped away, leaving her standing on the wet pavement, shaken and terrified. She ran all the way home, bursting into her small, cramped apartment. Her mother, Sarah, was sitting by the window, looking out at the rain. Today was one of her better days. "Mia, honey, you're soaked," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mia collapsed onto the sofa, finally letting the tears come. She told her mother everything: the billionaire at the restaurant, the emotional breakdown, the aggressive son, the offers of money, the threats. Sarah listened patiently, her expression growing sad. She reached out and took Mia's hand, her fingers frail and cool. Her eyes went to the locket around Mia's neck. "They want it that badly," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Mia. "I don't understand why. Why is it so important to them?" Mia sobbed. Sarah's gaze became distant, her mind drifting through the fog of her illness. "He made it for the girl with eyes like the sea," she whispered. The words disconnected a fragment of a memory, a star to guide her home before they sent her away. Mia frowned, confused. "What, Mom? Who sent who away?" But the moment of clarity was gone. Sarah's eyes glazed over. A faint smile played on her lips as she began humming a tune devoid of any discernible melody. Mia's heart ached. These cryptic words were yet another piece of the intricate, increasingly dangerous puzzle of her mother's past, a puzzle that grew more complex with each passing day. She clutched the locket tightly. It was no longer simply a cherished keepsake. It had become the epicenter of a maelstrom, and she, inescapably, was caught in its turbulent currents. Julian's aggressive tactics backfired spectacularly. When Elellanena learned from a distraught Jean-Pierre that Mia had been dismissed from her job at Aria, a dismissal orchestrated by Julian, she erupted in a blaze of incandescent fury. She immediately summoned Julian to her penthouse apartment. For the first time in years, he didn't see the frail, aging woman he'd come to expect, but rather the formidable, powerful figure who had stood by his father's side as he built his empire. "How dare you?" she demanded, her voice dangerously low, resonating with simmering rage. "How dare you use the power and wealth of this family to bully a young woman who has done nothing but work honestly for her living? You threatened her. You had her fired. I was protecting you, Julian," he retorted, stubbornly refusing to yield. "You were becoming obsessed, emotional. She's a nobody, a grifter looking for a quick payday. I solved the problem." "You are the problem, Julian," Elellanena countered, her disappointment a palpable, suffocating presence in the room. "You see the world as a series of transactions. You see people as mere assets or liabilities. You have your father's business acumen, but you possess none of his compassion. Leave. I will handle this myself. From now on, you will stay away from Amelia Russo." After Julian stormed out, his face a thunderous mask of indignation, Elellanena felt a profound sense of isolation. Her own son was a stranger to her, a man shaped and warped by the very wealth she now found utterly meaningless. She immediately contacted David Harrison. "I want to shift the focus of the investigation," she instructed, her voice firm and resolute. "I no longer care about Amelia Russo's finances. I want to know about her mother, Sarah Russo. Find her birth certificate. I need to know where and when she was born. Dig into the adoption records for that area and year. Cross-reference every single document. Spare no expense." It was a long shot. A wild, desperate gamble predicated on nothing more substantial than a gut feeling and a 50-year-old piece of jewelry. While Harrison's team embarked on the painstaking task of meticulously sifting through decades of sealed and archived records, Elellanena retreated into her own past. She unlocked a hidden safe concealed behind a painting in her study and retrieved a small, leather-bound box. Inside were a few treasured mementos from her time with Thomas Reed. There were several letters, penned in his elegant flowing script, filled with passionate declarations of love and shared dreams of a future together. There was a charcoal sketch he had made of her, capturing a light in her eyes that Richard, her husband, had never seen. And at the very bottom of the box, nestled within a small velvet pouch, was a single earring. A silver starburst adorned with a tiny sapphire at its center. It was the matching piece to the locket. Thomas had only had enough silver for 1.5 pairs. He'd given her the locket and 1 earring, keeping the other for himself as a promise. A promise to find her and their child. A promise he tragically never had the chance to fulfill. She clutched the earring, its sharp points digging painfully into her palm. The memories flooded back, vivid and agonizing. The sterile white walls of the clinic, the nurse's condescending pity, the crushing weight of her parents' decision presented as an immutable, inescapable reality. "It's for the best, Elellanena," they had said. "The child will have a good life with a proper family. You will forget. You will move on." But she had never forgotten, not for a single day. The ghost of her daughter, Lily, had haunted the periphery of her life, a constant, silent presence. Days bled into a week. Elellanena barely ate, her mind consumed by the past and fueled by desperate hope for the future. Then the call came. Mrs. Vance. David Harrison's voice was markedly different. The usual professional detachment was gone, replaced by a tone of almost reverential awe. "We found it. It took leveraging every contact I have and a court order from a very obliging judge, but we unsealed the records." Elellanena held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. Sarah Russo was born on October 12, 1973, at St. Jude's Mercy Home for Unwed Mothers in Monterey County, Harrison reported. She was placed for adoption a day later. Her birth mother is listed on the original sealed certificate. He paused, the silence heavy with anticipation. The name on the certificate is Elellanena Marguerite Chadwick. Chadwick, her maiden name. The world seemed to tilt precariously on its axis. The air rushed from Elellanenna's lungs. It was true. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a delusion. It was real. Sarah Russo was her Lily. The waitress, the quiet, resilient young woman named Amelia, was her granddaughter. "Mrs. Vance, are you still there?" Harrison's voice was laced with concern. "Yes," Elellanena whispered, tears blurring the panoramic view from her window into a hazy smear of blue and gold. "Yes, I'm here." A lifetime of grief and longing crested within her, not as a wave of sorrow, but as a tidal wave of impossible, earth-shattering joy. She had found her. After 50 years of searching, a waitress in a restaurant had unknowingly brought her daughter back to her. "There's more," Harrison said gently. "I looked into Sarah's adoptive parents. They were a kind, working-class couple. They passed away when Sarah was a teenager. She had a difficult life, and there's no record of Amelia's father. The birth certificate lists him as unknown. It explains so much. Why Sarah was alone, why they were struggling. Her daughter had lived a life of hardship, a world away from the gilded cage Elellanena inhabited. And now she was sick, her memory fading. Her fierce protective instinct, the maternal love she had been forced to suppress for 50 years, roared to life. She would not lose her daughter again, not now that she had finally found her. "Book the best neurological specialist in the country, Mr. Harrison," Elellanena commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she hadn't felt in years. "Dr. Alistair Finch at Johns Hopkins. Fly him to San Francisco on my private jet. Rent out an entire wing of the best hospital if you have to. And get me an address. I am going to see my granddaughter." For Mia, the world had become a landscape of fear. Julian Vance's threats echoed relentlessly in her mind. Her manager at the daily grind had become cold and distant, cutting her hours. She knew it was only a matter of time before she lost that job too. The letter from her landlord about a building-wide rent increase, an increase that seemed to inexplicably target only her, felt like another tightening of the vice. She was being systematically, silently squeezed by a force she was powerless to combat. Her mother's condition was worsening. The moments of lucidity were becoming fewer and farther between. Mia spent her days consumed by terror, feeling the walls closing in. The $75,000 she had refused now seemed like a foolish, prideful mistake. What was a piece of jewelry compared to her mother's well-being? One afternoon, while assisting her mother with lunch, Sarah's eyes suddenly cleared. She looked at Mia with a focus that had become heartbreakingly rare. "Mia," she said, her voice weak but clear, "the locket. Let me see it." Surprised, Mia removed the locket and placed it in her mother's palm. Sarah's frail fingers traced the starburst pattern, just as Eleanor's had in Mia's memories. "My mother gave this to me," Sarah whispered. "Not the woman who raised me. My real mother. I never met her. They told me she was very young and her family was very powerful. They made her give me away." Mia leaned closer, her heart pounding. Her mother had never spoken of this so clearly before. "What else, Mom? What did they tell you?" "Just that she loved me," Sarah said, a tear rolling down her cheek. "She left this for me. The nurse at the home, she made sure I got it. She said my mother called me Lily. She said the locket was a star to guide me." Her voice trailed off, the effort of remembering exhausting her. "There's something inside. Did you ever look?" Mia's breath hitched. She had tried to open the locket 1,000 times as a child, but it was stuck. The clasp fused shut by age. She had always assumed it was empty. "It's jammed, Mom. It never opens." "There's a trick," Sarah murmured, her eyelids fluttering. "A little notch on the third ray, from the top." Mia's hands trembled as she took the locket. She examined it closely, her fingers searching, and there it was. A tiny, almost invisible indentation on one of the engraved rays. Using her fingernail, she pressed down hard on the spot. There was a faint click. The locket sprang open. Mia gasped. Tucked inside the two halves were two tiny, perfectly preserved secrets. On one side, protected by a sliver of glass, was a minuscule, faded photograph. It was a picture of a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes the color of the sea. The same woman from the restaurant, but decades younger. Elellanena Vance. On the other side, sur our side, engraved in a delicate, swirling script, were 4 words. "For Lily, find me." Mia stared, her mind reeling, struggling to process the impossible truth. The woman from the restaurant. Her name was Elellanena. The name on her mother's original birth certificate was Elellanena. The nurse had said her mother called her Lily. For Lily, find me. Her mother, Sarah, was Lily, and the billionaire Elellanena Vance was her grandmother. The realization crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. The obsession with the locket, the offers of money, the tears. It wasn't about an object. It was about a person. It was about her mother. Just as this earth-shattering truth began to settle, there was a soft knock on the apartment door. Mia's first instinct was fear. Was it Julian Vance's men coming to evict them? She opened the door cautiously. Standing in the drab hallway of her apartment building was Elellanena Vance. She was not the imperious matriarch from the restaurant. She was dressed simply in a cashmere sweater and slacks. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a nervous, hopeful vulnerability. She was alone. "Amelia?" Elellanena said, her voice soft and hesitant. "May I please come in? I need to talk to you and your mother." Mia was speechless. She could only nod, stepping back to let the woman into her small, cluttered home. Elellena's eyes scanned the room, taking in the worn furniture, the stack of medical bills on the counter, the stark, grinding reality of their poverty. Her gaze was filled with a profound, soul-crushing regret. Her eyes finally landed on Sarah, who was sitting in her chair by the window, now lost in her own world again. Elellanena took a hesitant step forward, then another. "Lily," she whispered the name, a breath of air. A prayer she hadn't dared to speak aloud for 50 years. Mia held up the open locket. "She told me," Mia said, her voice choked with emotion. "She just told me everything." Elellanena looked from the locket in Mia's hand to the face of her daughter, then back to the face of her granddaughter. The resemblance was undeniable. The same determined set of the jaw, the same strength in their eyes. Tears streamed down Elellena's face once more. But this time they were not tears of grief. They were tears of homecoming. "I found you," Elellanena breathed, her voice breaking. "Oh, my darling girl, after all this time I finally found you." She reached out, not for the locket, but for Mia's hand. Her touch was gentle and warm. The gulf between the billionaire and the waitress vanished, erased by a truth that had been hidden within a silver starburst for half a century. The air in the small apartment was thick with the weight of 50 years. It was a sacred space, a bubble of time where past and present had finally converged. Elellanena knelt by Sarah's chair. Her manicured fingers, which had signed billion-dollar contracts, now trembled as they gently stroked the hair of the daughter she had only ever held in her memory. She whispered the name Lily, a soft, rhythmic chant, as if the sound itself could bridge the chasm of their lost decades. For a fleeting moment, Sarah's clouded eyes seemed to focus on her, and she leaned into the touch, a deep, instinctual comfort overriding the fog of her illness. Mia stood a few feet away, the open locket still warm in her hand. The world had tilted, its colors shifting into new, unrecognizable hues. She was no longer just Mia Russo, the perpetually exhausted waitress swimming against a tide of debt. She was Amelia, the granddaughter of Elellanena Vance, the living link between a painful, secret past and a future she couldn't yet begin to comprehend. The revelation was a dizzying mix of shock, relief, and a profound, bone-deep sorrow for the life her mother could have had. She looked at the two women, a tableau of reunion so raw and powerful, it felt like a dream, and her own tears began to fall silently. This fragile, holy moment was shattered by a sound from the hallway. Heavy, purposeful footsteps, followed by a sharp, authoritative rap on the door. That was less a knock and more a demand. Mia flinched, her fear of Julian Vance and his shadowy influence rushing back. Before she could react, the door was pushed open with enough force to make it bang against the wall. Julian Vance stood on the threshold, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was flanked by two broad-shouldered men in dark, impeccably tailored suits, their presence instantly sucking the warmth from the room. They were not bodyguards. They were instruments of power. Men who solved problems with quiet, unshakable efficiency. Julian's eyes swept across the scene, his gaze dripping with contempt. He saw his mother kneeling on the floor of this squalid apartment, the sick woman in the chair, and Mia, whom he saw as the architect of this entire charade. "I knew it," he spat the word, slicing through the quiet room. He strode forward, his expensive leather shoes scuffing on the worn linoleum. "I knew you were a predator. It's a masterful performance, I'll give you that. You find a lonely old woman, discover some obscure detail of her past, and then you weave this elaborate, pathetic fantasy." He stopped directly in front of Mia, towering over her. "How much did it take to convince her? 100,000? 2? What's the going rate for a fabricated family history these days?" Mia shrank back, intimidated, but also ignited by a spark of defiance. "You don't understand," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Julian interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "I understand that my mother is vulnerable, and you are a parasite who has attached herself to this family's wealth. Well, the game is over." He turned to his mother. "Mother, we are leaving now. These men will handle this transaction. They will retrieve your property and ensure Miss Russo understands the legal consequences of extortion." He nodded sharply at one of the men, who took a step towards Mia, his hand outstretched for the locket. "They will do no such thing, Julian." Elellena's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. She rose to her feet with a grace that defied her age, planting herself firmly between Julian's man and Mia. She was no longer the weeping, fragile woman from the restaurant or the remorseful mother on her knees. She was Elellanena Vance, the matriarch, and her eyes blazed with a protective fire Julian hadn't seen since his father's funeral. "This is not a transaction," she declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "And this," she said, gesturing to Mia, "is not a parasite. This is my granddaughter, Amelia. And this woman," her voice breaking with emotion as she pointed to Sarah, "is my daughter. My daughter, Lily." Julian let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Daughter, granddaughter, mother, listen to yourself. You are unwell. This pauper has poisoned your mind. You have never in my entire life mentioned a lost daughter." "Because I was made to feel ashamed," Elellena's voice boomed, startling them all with its power. "Because my parents, your grandparents, decided that the family name was more important than a baby girl. They cared more for appearances and their social standing than for their own child's heart. I was 17, Julian. I was a scared girl in love with a man they deemed unsuitable, and they tore my life apart. They sent me away. They took my baby, and they threatened the man I loved until he disappeared forever. They told me to forget, to move on, to bury the shame. And for 50 years, I have lived with that ghost." She took a step closer to her son, her gaze unwavering. "You are just like them. You see a problem, and you throw money or threats at it. You cannot fathom that something's value could be anything other than monetary. You look at Amelia, and you see a poor waitress. I look at her, and I see a young woman with more integrity and love in her heart than you have ever shown. I offered her a fortune, Julian. A life-changing sum of money that could have solved every one of her problems. And she refused. She refused because this locket, my locket, the one I placed in my daughter's blanket, meant more to her than all the money in the world. Elellena's gaze was relentless. You tried to destroy her. You had her fired. You threatened her housing. You used the full weight of the Vance name to crush a girl who had nothing. And still she protected her mother's only keepsake. She protected my daughter's legacy without even knowing what it was. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Julian stared at his mother, the absolute conviction in her voice shaking the very foundations of his reality. Mia, emboldened by Elellena's defense, held up her hand, the locket open in her palm. The light from the window caught the tiny, faded photograph of the young, smiling Elellanena. Julian's eyes were drawn to it, to the undeniable proof. He saw the face of his mother before she was his mother, a girl full of a light he had never known. He saw the inscription, "For Lily, find me." His carefully ordered world, a world of spreadsheets and market values, of clear wins and losses, fractured. The cold logic that had been his armor for so long shattered against the irrefutable truth of this emotional, messy human story. He looked from the locket to Mia, and for the first time, he didn't see a pauper. He saw a young woman with his mother's eyes. He looked at the frail, sick woman in the chair and saw not a prop in a scam, but his aunt, a member of his family who had lived a life of hardship while he had lived in unimaginable privilege. The magnitude of the family secret, the injustice of it all, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His entire identity was built on a lie of omission. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly pallor. The arrogance in his posture collapsed, leaving him looking suddenly younger and lost. He started to speak, but no words came. What could he say? He had been monstrous. He had wielded his power with cruelty, all in the name of a truth that was utterly false. Shame, a foreign and corrosive emotion, burned in his gut. He couldn't bear to look at his mother's disappointed face or at the quiet dignity of the girl he had tried to break. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked stiffly out of the apartment. He brushed past his confused men, leaving them in the doorway. "Go!" Elellanena commanded them, her voice quiet but firm. They glanced at each other, then retreated, closing the door softly behind them, sealing the new family within the quiet walls of the apartment. The storm had passed. In the ensuing silence, Mia finally let out a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Eleanor came to her, taking the locket in Mia's hand in her own. "He will come around," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or he won't. It doesn't matter. What matters is us now." With a newfound purpose, Elellanena pulled out her phone. She made a call. Her voice, a calm, commanding force that Mia now understood could move mountains. "This is Elellanena Vance. I need Dr. Alistair Finch. I don't care what his schedule is. My private jet is on the tarmac at SFO. I want him in this city by morning, ready to see a patient. Yes, cost is no object. Make it happen." She hung up and turned to Mia. Her eyes softened with a century of unshed tears. "Your mother will have the best care. You will have a home, a real home. You will never have to work 2 jobs again unless you choose to. You can go to school, travel, anything. The world is yours now, Amelia. Mia could only shake her head, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Elellanena said gently. She looked down at the locket, tracing the starburst with her finger. Your grandfather made this, she whispered, giving Mia the final piece of her story. His name was Thomas Reed. He was a brilliant painter, and he had the kindest soul I have ever known. He would have loved you so fiercely. Elellanena looked over at Sarah, who had drifted into a peaceful sleep. A real family. After a lifetime of loneliness in a palace of gold, Elellanena had finally found her home in a cramped two-room apartment with a daughter lost to time and a granddaughter she never knew she had. The Vance fortune of stocks and steel was vast, but it was nothing compared to this. This was the real inheritance. This was the inheritance of the heart. In the end, it wasn't Elellanena Vance's billions that healed her broken heart. It was the discovery that the greatest treasure she ever possessed was not something she could buy, but someone she had lost. The story of Eleanor, Mia, and Lily reminds us that family is not defined by wealth or status, but by the unbreakable threads of love that weave through generations, sometimes getting lost, but never truly severed. Mia's simple locket, worthless in a pawn shop, turned out to be priceless, for it held the key to unlocking a 50-year-old secret and reuniting a family torn apart by circumstance. It's a powerful testament to the idea that our true legacy lies in the connections we forge and the love we refuse to forget. If this story of loss and reunion touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Mia's position? Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a story about the enduring power of family. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of the extraordinary stories hidden within ordinary lives.